everything. So we're not going to talk a lot about that. We're actually going to talk about what happens when you don't listen to me and do that. So this is about all the metabolic problems that happen over time. And then we'll obviously tie it all in, because the only way you help this situation is through those four things: through diet, through nutrition, through exercise, through stress, or through reducing your stress, and sleep. This will all tie in at the end, but it's just going to really follow a path for you to understand what happens today affects you tomorrow, even if your blood levels look good today. It doesn't mean that there's lots of bad stuff happening inside. So that's what we're going to talk about. And so I was deciding, I've done a PowerPoint presentation, and I was deciding if I was going to photocopy it for you, I was going to send it out early. I will send it out to you guys so you have it after, but I just want you to just sort of listen rather than be reading and trying to, and so you can write notes if you want. So I'm just going to read from my PowerPoint, and then I'm going to just try to stop throughout so that you can ask questions and try to get the most. So it's going to be kind of a little bit sciencey, so I've tried to not make it sciencey, even though it is all based in science. So if you don't understand something I'm saying, then just stop me. We're not on Zoom or anything like that. Just say, hey, can you repeat that or whatever? I don't care. I want you to understand what I'm saying. So please ask questions, and I'm going to stop throughout to ask if you have questions, but don't feel like I want you to interrupt me. So we are going to start. So this has been up on my board for a while, and so people kept asking me, like, what does metabolic health mean? What does metabolic dysfunction mean? How do I know if I have it, or how do I stop it, or whatever? So that's what we're going to talk about, and this stuns me. So when I first heard the first podcast about it, I was like, it just really can't be true. That's really scary. And then I listened to the next podcast, and then I followed up, and I did some research, and it is true. And so it's a really scary statistic that out of 100% of our population, 88% of the people in our country cannot consider themselves metabolically healthy. The guidelines for that are there's 5 risk factors, and we're going to talk about that there's 5 risk factors that they use in this, how they decide, are you metabolically healthy or not? And if you have just one of the 5, then they consider you not an unhealthy person, but you have one risk factor that does not make you optimally metabolically healthy. So 12% of the population are optimally metabolically healthy, and 88% are not. And for me, the part that drives me the most crazy is like in this COVID world that we're living in right now, it is all talk about we got to wear masks, we got to social distance, we got to shut down schools, we got to do this, we got to do that, all this stuff, and that's fine, except nobody talks about why we all died. And so most of the people, not all of the people, but most of the people that died were compromised. So even the elderly population, the people that were healthy elderly people didn't necessarily die. They could fight it. It was the people that were unhealthy. And so some, like Robin, for example, she can't do anything about she's got asthma. So she didn't make choices to have asthma, so she can't do anything about that. But most of us made choices, or most of those people made choices. And so it drives me crazy as a person in my field that we don't talk about that. That's not on the news, that why are we so unhealthy? And how do we make that so that this doesn't happen again? And if this was the other way around, if it was 88% of us healthy and 12% of us unhealthy, we wouldn't be living through a pandemic right now. It wouldn't be happening. And so I'm going to do my little piece, and most people don't listen to me, but I'm like, I just have to talk about it because it just drives me crazy. So what does it mean? Optimal metabolic health is a state of being where all the biochemical processes in the body that regulate blood sugar and lipids are fats, are operating normal. So it's all based on your sugar levels and your fat levels, and that's why when you go to the doctor, they test your blood sugars and they test your all your enzymes and all your blood levels in terms of your fat content in your body. So because that identifies things that are going on inside of you. So metabolic dysfunction is the abnormal regulation of blood sugars and lipids or fats, as well as systemic inflammation. So systemic inflammation happens when our blood sugars are elevated, when our lipids are elevated. If left unaddressed, it can ultimately lead to common chronic diseases and causes of death, such as hypertension, which is high blood pressure, diabetes, polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS, if you've ever heard of that, heart disease, and stroke. So it's all those ones that I've talked about before. You can't help if you have asthma. You can't help if you get rheumatoid arthritis. There's certain things that they're not out of your control, but the things like hypertension, diabetes, PCOS, heart disease, stroke, those are all in your control, mostly. So that's what this is talking about. Well, the underlying process of abnormal glucose and lipid processing and systemic inflammation is the same. A person's unique genetic makeup and environmental exposure determines how the metabolic dysfunction will manifest itself. So just because I get a heart attack or I get heart disease, you might get PCOS and you might get high blood pressure. It's all coming from the same source. All of those things are the same. They're coming from the same same problem in terms of how we live our lives and the choices we live. It's just how they manifest itself. So I might be more prone to getting high blood pressure. You might be more prone to getting diabetes. It's all still the same thing. It's just how it's going to come about. There's 3 phases of metabolic dysfunction. So the first phase is what most people are in, and it's generally silent and can go on for years. And I'm not talking like 5 years. I'm talking 10, 15 years, 20 years of stuff that goes on in our body before we go to the doctor and it says we have high blood sugar. So, or that we have high blood pressure. So thinking that, sorry, I just jumped ahead of myself. Usually in this phase, the individual feels fine. Body weight likely starts to increase, though normal body weight is not an indicator of optimal health. Skinny people can have numerous metabolic health risks. So what that's just saying is, people say to me all the time, because when I'm, somebody asks my opinion, I give it like, well, my blood work's good, and I eat like crap, and I'm just like that doesn't matter. Like, it's all that stuff is happening on the inside. Just because your blood work is good doesn't mean you're good. It takes about 10 to 15 years for things to start to show up. So doctors in their blood tests and all that, they don't really catch any of this until you're in phase 2, and then all of a sudden the medications become needed. But it's already, the damage is being done. So think when you go to the doctor and you're like, I don't have a great lifestyle, but well, my blood sugar's good, so I'm good. What's happening there is all this stuff is going on and it is slowly damaging. Your pancreas is working hard with the insulin. The lipid levels from all the food you are eating is slowly building up. It doesn't show on blood work yet, but eventually it's going to come out. And once it comes out, it hasn't just overnight gone, wow, you got diabetes just like that. It's been years in the process. So just think what we do in our 20s and 30s and even our 40s. Usually it's when we're in our late 40s, 50s, and 60s, all of a sudden we have the blood pressure problems and we have the diabetes problems or the blood sugar problems. That just didn't happen because you turned 50. It's because of all the stuff you did until you turned 50. So I just wanted to make sure you are aware of that and not feel like, oh, well, my blood work is good, I'm fine. That's like that false sense of, yes, I'm okay, when really it just hasn't reared its head yet. So phase 2 is characterized by one or more chronic diseases. So this is where you go to the doctor, you have high blood pressure. You started to become pre-diabetic, or you get type 2 diabetes. This does not include type 1 diabetes, right? We all know that's genetic. Hyperlipidemia, that means you have a high level of fat in your diet or in your bloodstream. Fatty liver and others. Individuals may still feel generally well, right? Most people, if they have high blood pressure, I didn't even know I had high blood pressure. But they may carry these diagnoses and then start to have to take medication to keep them under control, right? And we think that fixes us, and really all it does is keep us under control, because if we don't change anything, it just because we take blood pressure medicine to reduce our blood pressure, if we don't change our lifestyle, all that's doing is just putting a little Band-Aid on there, and all that stuff is still going on inside your body. The medication's pushing it down, keeping it under control, but eventually it's going to start rearing its head again. Phase 3 is what we are all trying to avoid: significant impairment or death from end-stage complications of metabolic dysfunction, including heart attack, stroke, limb or loss of vision. So that's where people who have diabetes and they have a slow, your mom went through it, right? It was terrible. Your mom is like a classic example of just what happens. Diabetes is the slow killer, where you just piece by piece by piece. And again, people who have diabetes don't realize that when they get diagnosed and they're like, well, I can just take some more insulin, or I can just take more of my pills that control my blood sugar and I can still keep eating sugar. No, it's just like wearing out your pancreas to the point where then things just don't work very well anymore. So that's what metabolic dysfunction is. Diagnosing it, so this is what we're kind of talking about today. There's 5 things or 5 risk factors that decide where you fit in the terms of the 88% healthy or unhealthy or the 12% healthy. So the 5 risk factors, any one of these risk factors may be present by itself, but they tend to occur together. So like I said, just because if we both eat a really bad diet, I might get diabetes, but eventually I'm probably going to get heart disease to go along with my diabetes, just like diabetics have heart problems and kidney problems. It's all just this one big bowl of bad stuff. Having at least one puts you in the category of metabolic dysfunction, meaning that you would not be deemed metabolically healthy. Having 3 of the 5 puts you in it diagnoses you with metabolic syndrome. So if you've ever heard your doctor talking about that, that means you hit 3 of the 5 and you're now in a metabolic syndrome state. Okay, the 5 risk factors. The first one, and this is like they hadn't used this for a while, and now they've started to use it because it's such a strong indicator of what's going on in your body, is waist circumference. So waist circumference of 35 inches for women and 40 inches or more for men is one of the 5 risk factors, because if you have a big waist, you probably have, well, you do have your fat collected here. It's called it's adipose fat, but there's another word for it. But anyways, it is the fat that covers your organs, so it's bad fat. So then that waist circumference is a really good indicator. If you are over 35 for females or over 40, it means you have lots of adipose fat, and it is worse fat for you than subcutaneous fat, which is the fat on your legs and your arms. So it's more dangerous, more damaging. It causes more of the problems than what other fat does. Triglycerides, so we've all heard that where we go to the doctor and they're like, oh, your triglycerides are high or low. So that's one of the factors. If you have high triglycerides, 150 milligrams per deciliter or higher, that you don't need to remember that because it'll all be on your blood work or whatever. Or are you on meds to treat that? So if you're on meds and you've dropped it down to a normal level, that doesn't mean you're healthy. It just means you put yourself in, put medication into your life to drop it down. So if you didn't drop it down with diet and lifestyle changes, then medication, if you're on it, that is considered a risk factor. HDL cholesterol is low. So HDL is the good cholesterol or the good fat in your body. And so you need that. You need it at a high level, and usually people that have a bad diet or poor risk or poor choices have low HDLs of less than 50 milligrams per deciliter. So that's one if you have low HDLs. And again, if you're on meds to treat it as well, just because it's low, if you're on meds, that puts you in that risk category. Blood pressure, it used to be 130 over 85. You're probably going to learn this. So when I went to school as a nurse, it was 120. If you had 120 over 80, it was like, wow, you're great. But they're starting to see that even people with 120 over 80 are starting to show signs of metabolic disorder. So they're even, this study up here, what this did, they took it at, if you were at 120 over 80, you were still considered, that was a risk factor. You had to be below 120 and you had to be below 80 for you to be considered healthy in that study. And if you're on meds to treat your blood pressure to bring it down, obviously that's still a risk factor. Fasting blood sugar is the last one, so the 5 of them: waist circumference, triglycerides, high HDL or low HDL's blood pressure, and then fasting blood sugar. So fasting blood sugar is the one that's going to tell you if your blood sugars are too high and that you're at risk for diabetes. Statistics, just some statistics for you. Metabolic syndrome has a prevalence of 24% in the U.S. Adults and 43% of the U.S. in adults over 60 years old. So syndrome means they have 3 or more symptoms, right? So this one is you have 1 or more. Syndrome means you have 3 of the 5. 24% of the U.S. adults have 3 or more, and then 43% of the adults in 60 years or older have that as well. So that just tells you it's not because the 60-year-olds all of a sudden decided to become unhealthy overnight, that as you get older, all those things just start to pick up and they start to be noticed. So at 60 years old now, half of the population in the U.S. is got 3 of the syndromes, or 3 of the risk factors. 50% of all deaths in the U.S. are caused by the end result of metabolic syndrome. So that's, to me, that's just crazy. 40% of the deaths in this country could be avoided if you just lived a better life. So it's just crazy to me. And then we've already talked about that. Okay, development. How does it develop? So it doesn't just it doesn't just show up overnight. So the number one thing, and I don't know if anybody knows Greg Glassman. So he used to be the owner of CrossFit. He is no longer the owner of CrossFit, but he did some remarkable things, and he brought all of this to light. He really did. There was all these other studies that used to say sugar wasn't the problem and fat was the problem, and he was the one that sort of led the charge on all of this. And so the number one thing that causes metabolic syndrome to start is excess carbohydrate consumption. So he used to say there's two things that are causing us to be unhealthy is carbohydrates and sitting on the couch. So his prescription for that was get off the carbs and get off the couch. And that's how I live my life, and that's how I run my business. Get off the carbs and get off the couch. So it's the number one thing. That's where it all starts, is excess carbs consumption. That means sugar, and that means processed carbs. So carbohydrates are in the form of fruits and vegetables. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about processed carbohydrates. So that's the breads, that's the cereals, that's all the sugars and everything. That's what we're talking about. The entire process starts with an increased carbohydrate consumption that leads to increased sugar circulating in the bloodstream, which leads to increased insulin levels. So if you don't know the science of how sugar moves, we eat it, it floats around in our bloodstream, but our body needs glucose for energy and to survive. So then the carbohydrates get moved into our blood, into our cells, because that's what we need. But when you have excess carbohydrate consumption, there's all this glucose floating around in your body, and so it has to be moved to the cells, and that's where insulin comes in. So we need insulin to move the sugar or the glucose in our bloodstream into our cells so that our bodies can use it. And a person that eats a normal amount of carbohydrates, the insulin does what it's supposed to do, moves into the cells, and then it's all nice and balanced and everything works well. But if you have a high carbohydrate diet, then it needs more insulin and more insulin and more insulin. And pretty soon it doesn't even react, the insulin doesn't work anymore, the amounts, and so then it starts to increase the insulin levels, and then the pancreas gets tired, and then we have these high insulin levels, and it just starts to snowball with that. Okay, visceral adiposity, that is what I was talking about, the visceral fat. So that's the second thing that starts to develop. So first we have excess carbohydrate consumption. The visceral adiposity, that is one of the things that happens with metabolic syndrome. So when the muscles are full, then the insulin, so if the muscles have all the glucose that they need, then and there's nowhere for it to go, the insulin says it needs to go to the fat, or needs to be stored somewhere else. We have nowhere else to store it, and that's what ends up happening. Our muscles can only take so much glucose, but we have all this glucose floating around in our body because we keep eating carbs. So then the body's like, well, what do I do with it? So we can't just throw it out. It doesn't work that way. So then they move it into the fat cells, and so that's why excess carbs make us fat, because then we move this glucose into the fat, and in the fat it can't really be used as energy then. It's just used as fat instead of being used as energy. So we do need glucose, like I said, properly to make our muscles work and make our brain work and all that. But the excess goes to our fat cells, and then we become fat. Over time, this can lead to increased body fat or obesity, in particular the fat around our organs, so the visceral fat that I talked about in the abdomen, which contributes to increased abdominal circumference, which is why it's one of the risk factors. Visceral fat tissue is very metabolically active and releases more than 50 different molecules called adipokines. I practiced this word. But anyways, what that means is secretion of these molecules leads to increased inflammation and contributes to insulin resistance. So insulin resistance, if you've ever heard that word or you people talking about that, when you become insulin resistant, and that's where the problems start, that's when you start to develop diabetes, is because you keep eating a whole bunch of carbohydrates, the insulin has to come out, the pancreas produces more insulin, dumps it in there, then we eat more, and they have to just keep doing this, and pretty soon our body's just like, it doesn't react to that anymore. So just then that we can't give it enough insulin, so then the pancreas just keeps producing more and more and more insulin, and finally the pancreas gets tired, and the insulin just doesn't work the way it's supposed to work anymore. So usually you eat some sugar or eat some glucose, and it comes in and it puts it into the cells where it's supposed to go. But if it's just constantly, eventually that you need more and more and more insulin, and that's what insulin resistance is. But the adipose fat, so the visceral fat, helps promote that, helps make the insulin more resistant, and it increases the inflammation in our body. So that's why it's number 2. Number 3, insulin resistance, what we just talked about. If there's excess carbohydrate intake and elevated blood sugar, large amounts of insulin are required in order to keep storing the blood sugar in the tissues. Eventually, this leads to a state of insulin resistance, which is where the cells don't respond properly to the insulin. It eventually just takes more and more insulin to get the cells to receive the signal and take in sugar for storage. I said I was going to ask questions, and I'm just sitting here talking. Any questions up to this point? Everybody knows I love to talk. So. It's like pretty sciencey. So is everybody clear on what I'm saying so far? Any questions? No? All right, I'll keep talking then. Okay, so that is the insulin resistance part of it. So that's number 3. So we first had the development of metabolic syndrome. Carbohydrates is number 1. Visceral adiposity, which is visceral fat, is number 2. Insulin resistance, so now our insulin isn't working very well. Our pancreas isn't working very well, so things are starting to bubble up. Now lipid abnormalities, so now this is lipid means fat, so now this is where our fat, the blood levels that they take in our body with the fat, all the different types of fat, triglycerides and HDLs and LDLs. This is where this comes. So excess glucose gets moved to the liver, which we just talked about. When this storage overfills, it starts affecting how the lipids are transported in our body. So we need fat, right? We need good fat in our body, and good fat is good for us, and fat is good for us. Fat is not causing the problem, so good fats are not causing the problem in our diet. So eating steak and eating butter and eating milk or drinking milk and eating yogurt, that's not our problem. It's the sugar that goes with it, all the carbohydrates. So we need fat, and it gets transported in our bodies in a functional way that helps give our body the energy and keeps us full and does what it's supposed to do. But eventually, if they are being transported properly, eventually it increases our fat because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. So then it's not moving through the highway of our body like it's supposed to. So then it just starts overfilling and spilling into our bloodstream because it's just too full, because we've taken the glucose that doesn't fit in our muscles anymore, we've moved it to our fat cells, and then our fat cells are eventually like, we can't take anymore. So then they spill it out back into the bloodstream, and then you start to get your triglyceride levels start to increase, and your HDLs start to decrease, which is 2 of the risk factors, right? Fat cells become insulin resistant as well, which further contributes to the problem. So the fat cells no longer listen to the insulin at all, and so then they just keep spilling out all of that stuff into your bloodstream, and your triglycerides just keep rising, and it just starts to snowball on itself. Hyperinsulinemia, which means it just means there's too much insulin in our body. In the end, all key insulin responsive tissues, so insulin is needed in our liver, in our muscle, and in our fat, becomes resistant to the insulin. So all of the muscles, so like the muscles, the fat tissue, the liver, all becomes resistant to that insulin, and the body has to use higher and higher levels of insulin in order to break through this resistance and get the sugar out of the bloodstream and stored into the tissues. This high circulating level of insulin in the bloodstream is called hyperinsulinemia. This leads to increased production of inflammatory markers, which this is where we get that state of systemic inflammation, which means overall inflammation. It doesn't mean I banged my arm and now I've got a bruise. It's the inside, and you'll hear your doctors or you'll hear me talk about it all the time, that it's that inflammation that causes the diseases that we end up having with all of this. So as the liver and the muscle and the tissues, or the fat tissues, aren't responding to insulin, all those things are starting to create this inflammation in the body. And systemic means all over your body, okay? So that's what that means. And then elevated blood sugars, so we've talked about this quite a bit. Eventually, insulin gets produced in the pancreas, and that's how it gets moved out into the body, is the pancreas uses it. Eventually, the pancreas gets so tired from having to make so much insulin that the cells just start to die off. And so that's when, so the cells are still dying off, you are still not going to go to the doctor and your blood sugars be high at that point. It takes once your cells start to die off, it takes about 12 years before you actually start to have high blood sugar. So think about how much damage can be done in 12 years. And there would have been damage before that, because you first had to get to a state where your pancreas pancreas couldn't work very well anymore. So you first had to have a whole bunch of years where you were eating a whole bunch of bad food for your pancreas to finally be like, okay, I quit, I can't do it. And then it starts to die off. And even then, 12 years after that, it still tries to keep doing its job. Your blood sugars still don't start to rise at that point. So imagine, that's why most people, when they're in their, not till their 40s or their 50s, all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, I've got diabetes, and yet I was fine for all these years. You weren't fine for all these years. So less insulin is produced, so then the blood sugar can't be stored in the tissues as efficiently, so blood sugar concentrations start to rise. The end result of this is a metabolic catastrophe called diabetes. But that's the end result. That is, like, then it's almost too late at that point. You've got diabetes. This is why elevated blood sugar is a risk factor. It's important to note that a lot has happened up until this point. I've already said this. This process of metabolic dysfunction can be taking place for numerous years before it actually is apparent on a blood test. So the biggest thing I want you guys to take away from that is, don't have this false sense of security that when you go to the doctor and the doctor's like, you're good, it's all good, and yet you're like, oh, whew, dodged that bullet, even though you knew that you're not doing everything right. It's going to catch up to you eventually. Elevated blood pressure, so that is one of the risk factors, right? So high circulating levels of glucose and insulin coupled with inflammation also contribute to elevated blood pressure. In simple terms, it affects the constriction and relaxation of the blood vessels, which then starts to affect your blood pressure. So this is why blood pressure is a risk factor, so that just the circulating, again, the insulin and the glucose starts to affect how your muscle or how your blood vessels move. And so the constriction, we want our blood vessels to like constrict and relax, but when you start to have all that systemic inflammation in your body, it starts to harden them so that they don't work as well. And then when they don't work as well, the blood can't pump as well. And so then that's why we get high blood pressure. Vascular damage, the dysregulated glucose and lipid metabolism, as well as chronic systemic inflammation, eventually leads to damage of the large and small arteries. So vascular damage is just talking about, where is it going to show up? Are you going to have a heart attack and it's going to be in your heart, or is it going to be in your brain and it's going to be a stroke? It's all the same thing. It's just where the blood clot just happens to land as to where you're going to have, whether you're going to have a heart attack or a stroke. So that's what it's talking about with vascular damage. So the arteries, the large and the small arteries, will start to get the plaque that you hear talked about or whatever, and so all that stuff just slowly. That does not, again, happen overnight where you just have a heart attack and go, I was perfectly fine yesterday. No, you weren't. You were just slowly over time building up the plaque in your walls till the littlest tiny blood clot flows through there and can get through, and then you have a heart attack. The small arteries are also affected, and that's where it really starts to affect people with diabetes. So again, people, and I see people all the time that just take more insulin and then I can eat sugar, I can do whatever I want. Vicky's mom, Vicky saw it firsthand where it just slowly over time eats away, like a toe here, and then you lose your eyesight, and then it's a foot, and then it's up to the knee, and it just slowly kills you from the inside out, basically. So that's where the small arteries are affected with diabetes, and it eventually leads to kidney failure, dialysis, diabetic foot disorders, severe infections. That's what the diabetics end up having is they don't have any kind of blood flow going to the extremities. It's so impaired at that point that they get like a cut and it turns into a massive infection and it just won't heal. Your mom went through that as well. All right. Gut microbiome. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but they have started to talk about this, that if you've ever heard of like you're supposed to take probiotics and stuff like that, they are really starting to understand that probiotics and healthy food helps your gut microbiome, right? So it helps the gut performance, and that is a strong player in terms of the development of systemic inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. So that's basically just saying what you eat, like the types of food you eat in terms of whole food or processed food. It affects not just the glucose levels and the blood sugar or the blood level, the lipid levels in your body. It actually affects the gut biome in your body, and that's your first layer of defense is your gut, right? What goes in your body into your gut is the first, it takes all the stuff and starts to move it around. And so if you don't have a good microbiome in your gut, then it just starts to lead to other diseases as well. All right, so that was all of our what things start to happen to cause metabolic symptoms. Yes?
How do you know if you have a good microbiome going on?
They do say, like, so I do probiotics now. I didn't. If you have a good gut, usually you have everything flowing well. So you don't have problems with constipation, you don't have problems with diarrhea, you don't have a lot of problems with a whole bunch of gas all the time, acid reflux, indigestion. All those things are saying that your gut is not working properly, and it's always from the foods you eat. And so usually when I'm working with somebody as a nutritionist, you start to take all the bread away and the sugar away, and you start to eat a healthy diet, and they're like, oh, I don't have heart disease, or I don't have acid reflux anymore, or so that just tells you that everything's settling down. And so if you don't have a lot of good gut health, it just churns everything up all the time, and you've always got indigestion, or you're suffering from constipation. If everything's going smoothly and you know you eat a really good diet all the time, you probably have a good gut microbiome. They still say you should take probiotics as well. And I just actually started, I didn't used to take them, but I did just start taking them. Not because I felt like I needed, I was just like, well, I guess I should do that as well now. I take, what I do is that's why I use the Mercola protein now, because it has 15 billion probiotics in it. So that's why I use Mercola now, so that I don't have to take the package. It's already in mine.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it sounds like carbs are
Evil?
part of, yeah. So is that something that like most of us there would be like a guide that most of us should have in a day, or it's going to differ by gender or by age, or?
If you, the only people that should be eating like a high carbohydrate diet or have high carbohydrate consumption is like high level athletes, because they need the energy. So carbohydrates give us energy, and so we should all be eating carbohydrates in the form of fruits and vegetables, and that's where it basically ends in terms of what we should eat for carbohydrates. So the athletes, if they just ate like we're talking high level, like the ones that are competing, like in CrossFit or the NHL or whatever, somebody that's playing and practicing for 2 or 3 hours a day and playing games 2 or 3 times a week, those guys need a lot of energy, so then they would have higher carbohydrate needs. The rest of us do not. We just don't. And then it doesn't really, they say 40, 30, 30, and that's fine. So 40% carbs, 30% fat, 30% protein, and that's a good guideline. If you just eat a healthy diet, if you just focus on eating protein, so meat sources, and fruits and vegetables, some nuts, a little bit of seeds, and no sugar, which again is Greg Glassman. That's all. If you just do that, I wish, I help people with nutrition, but it is as simple as that, right? Like, it just is that simple, but it's just hard because we build our diets, and the U.S. builds their diets around carbohydrates, and so they're in everything. So if you just did that, if you just ate protein and you built your plate around protein, vegetables, and like healthy carbs, like fruits or like vegetables and fruits and potatoes and sweet potatoes, you would be fine. You don't have to count certain things, because if you fill your plate with that, it's just going to be what it is. It's just, but if you don't fill your plate that way, so the way they want you to fill your plate is half carbs or half vegetables, which is volume carbs, meaning there's very few carbs in vegetables. You can eat all you want of those. A quarter of your plate protein, and then a quarter of your plate healthy carbs, meaning starches like potatoes or sweet potatoes or butternut squash or something like that. If you build it that way, you'll be healthy. You just will. But what we do is we squish in something else. And so when you put something else on your plate can only be 100%. And so if you put in 40% of potato chips on your plate, or French fries or whatever, then it doesn't leave room for the other stuff. And so the other stuff just gets pushed off of your plate. So that's what I try to tell people. 40, 30, 30 is good. And if you build your plate the way I just said, you'll kind of be 40, 30, 30. But if you don't want to even count that, it's just half of it has to be vegetables, a quarter of it has to be protein, and a quarter of it has to be like a starchy carb, because that's where we get our energy from. And it's not processed. And so if you just shop around the circumference of your grocery store, which we've all heard, it's true though. Like if you just stay outside there and you just buy whole food, less processed food, you will lose weight and you will not have a health problem. Did that answer your question? All right, we good? All right, assessing metabolic health. So how we go about doing that? So body composition is one. So the doctor will measure your BMI. I'm not a big fan of BMI, and it even talks about that it's not very accurate because BMI is just strictly height to weight ratio. It doesn't take into account what your muscle mass is and what your fat mass is. It just takes those two. And so somebody that has a lot of muscle mass can look, like I always go, and they're always like, well, you know, you're a little overweight. And I'm just like, okay, whatever. So, but that's because I have a high level of muscle mass, so I weigh more than what they would think I would weigh, and so then anyways, whatever. So, but it is a good indicator. Like if you aren't muscular and you have a high BMI, you can trust that that's probably right. Like if you know you're carrying a lot of fat and your BMI is high, it's probably not, you're probably not going, well, no, I think I have a lot of muscle mass under here somewhere. It's probably not that. So abdominal circumference, which we already talked about, so that's another way to assess body composition. We don't gain muscle right here. If you want a six-pack to show up, you need it to be nice and flat. So that will help assess body composition. Waist to hip ratio, the doctors will do that sometimes, or I've done that before, where your waist to your hip ratio, it talks about that. And then the body fat percentages are probably the best. So the InBody that we have here, because that measures your muscle mass to your fat mass, and you actually get to see what you're made of. And then it actually tells you in terms of body fat percentages, because body fat percentages identify where you range in terms of health, in terms of how much body fat you have. Blood pressure, so everybody knows they go to the doctor. So it used to be 120/80. Now it is saying less than 120 and less than 80 in terms of a normal blood pressure. So once you're at 120/80, it can start to indicate that hypertension is in your future. So it's not saying you have hypertension at 120/80. It just might be that, like, okay, you're getting pretty close. You better start like figuring stuff out here. Okay. Glucose and insulin levels. So those are all things you have to go to your doctor for. Obviously, you can't just like do that on your own. But that's what your doctor tests: fasting blood sugars, hemoglobin, A1C. The blood glucose, or the glucose tolerance test. So those are all testing how your body is processing the sugar, and it will test whether the hemoglobin A1C tests how well your pancreas is working. So is your pancreas starting to get tired? So that's what those things all test. But again, you got to go to your doctor for that, obviously. Dyslipidemia, that's testing your triglycerides and your HDLs and your LDLs and all that. That's your basic lipid panel that the doctor will do. And then systemic inflammation. There's numerous different markers out there that they use to test that. I'm not going to list all of them. One that you might hear your doctor talk about is CRP. That's just testing all those different inflammatory markers, is just testing how much inflammation is actually happening inside your body. Okay, and then lastly, we're just going to talk at the end, lifestyle factors that drive metabolic health. So I've talked about this, and we've had numerous Zoom chats while we were in shutdown phase, and nothing's changed, it's still the same. So nutrient dense diet, so that's what we were just talking about with Robin there. If you eat whole food, and you can't look, if it's in a package and it has a label on it, it's not whole food. Whole food comes from the earth. So, people are always like, well, but look at this. And look at this, and I'm like, yeah, it's okay. Like, it's not terrible. It's okay to eat it, but you really want most of your diet to be whole food. If it comes from a box or it comes from a bag and it has a label, it's not whole food. That means it was produced in a factory. So if it comes from a factory, it's not considered whole food. You wanted low carbohydrates, especially refined carbohydrates and sugar. So sugar, if you start to look at labels, is in absolutely everything. So Whole30, when you go on a Whole30 diet, if you get, well, I know you guys have been on it, it's pretty eye-opening when you're like, God, I can't have this, I can't have this, I can't have this. It's really eye-opening because they take all sugar out of your diet other than fruit, and it is pretty eye-opening to realize sugar isn't everything we eat. Okay, getting regular exercise, so that is what we do here. And I just wanted to point out, so high intensity interval type exercise, which is CrossFit, has been proven to reduce body fat, lower insulin resistance levels, so helping your insulin come back down and be where it's supposed to be, improve glucose tolerance, meaning that our body can tolerate the amount of glucose it's got in it and it can push it into the cells like it's supposed to, improve blood pressure and increase muscle mass. Traditional aerobic exercise like walking and jogging and biking, I'm not saying those are bad, I'm just saying if that is your primary source of exercise, it has been negligible in terms of any of those effects. So what you're doing in here, I just wanted you to know that. What you're doing in here is good, it matters in terms of not just looking good in a bikini, but being good on the inside. It's been proven and it matters. Reducing and learning how to manage the physical impacts of stress. So we had a whole presentation on that. I did a thing on that in terms of Zoom about stress, and it's real. So it's more impactful than I ever thought it was. And so when I started doing the research for the Zoom, it's easy to say just reduce your stress, but it really does impact how your body deals with glucose. So all those things will start to show effects. If you could even have like a pretty decent diet, and if you have stress in your life, it attacks your body the same way as what sugar and all of that kind of stuff attacks your body. And then getting good in that good quality sleep, which is stressing me out right now because I am not getting that, because I'm up every morning at 4:30. So yeah, I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna get diabetes. So it's causing me stress too. So I'm just like, I'm not getting sleep and I'm stressed because I'm not getting sleep. So, and they've done studies where people, I hope not me, but people that have like good sugar levels, and they put them through like a sleep study where they take sleep away and they test their blood throughout. And I think I talked about that when we did the sleep study, or did the sleep Zoom call, that they show signs of pre-diabetes just after like 2 or 3 days. So I'm like, anyways, I'll be fine. And then so 7 hours, it's literally 7 hours is good. Less than 7 hours is not good, and it's like a line. Like, so if you get 6.5 hours, it will be impactful. 7 hours is good or more, and that's it. That's all I got to say.
What about the you talked about the outside of the grocery store, and what about whole grains like quinoa? I know those are in packages, come from a factory, but they're not.
Yeah. So I think so. That is where. So if you, anytime, like any of the nutrition that I've done has been, those should be like in moderation or used like once or twice a week. Don't make those a primary source of your diet because they're still ultimately a grain. So I eat them. I eat a little bit of bitter rice sometimes, or quinoa or oatmeal or whatever. I just don't eat it every day. So grains have been proven to be inflammatory to our body, but yet healthy too because they've got fiber in them and they help move things through, and they are, and that, like, they're a healthy food, right? They are in a bag or whatever, but if you just get like quinoa, it is just a grain. And so I just wouldn't eat that kind of stuff every day, like once or twice a week, because again, how I look at that is, if that's always on my plate, that means something like sweet potatoes or butternut squash or potatoes that are a better source of carbohydrates aren't on my plate. And that's how I kind of look at things like that. They're not bad, it's just that what spot did it take? So it took somebody's spot on your plate, and so then you just don't want that on your plate all the time.
So Carla, you talked a lot about like how we won't see the signs until 12, 15 years later. Most of us in here are over the age of 30 or 40. So is there a way to like make the arrow go the other way?
Absolutely. So that's these, the lifestyle factors will make the arrow go the other way. So if that hasn't shown up on a blood test yet and you're not on medication yet, you're still good. You've got time to switch that. And I'm not even saying at 50 that you don't have time to switch that. It's just harder. Damage is being done at that point. But if everything is showing up good, live a healthy lifestyle. It will all slowly go back the other way. So don't wait for the doctor to go, oh, now you have high blood pressure. And you're like, yeah, now I gotta go on blood pressure. Or that's usually what happens is people get diagnosed with high blood pressure, like, I gotta change my diet, I gotta do this, I gotta do that. And yes, you do. You just should have done it before and it would have been easier. But yeah, this is all reversible. So that's why lifestyle choices, that's the good thing about it, right? Like, so if you get asthma, you can't just be like, well, maybe I'll just do this and my asthma will go away. It's just not gonna go away, so you have to learn to live with it. Lifestyle choices and factors and all metabolic health stuff, that stuff all can go away. So, and especially if it's like not in your 60s, you have a good chance of just putting it all back together and being healthy.
So in our 40s, we're feeling what we did in our 20s.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly, those choices matter.
Oh man.
All of that damage, all that stuff that you did, you know, it's just chronic, and it just starts to just build up to the point where your body's like, all right, I give up. You either gotta fix something or we're done, kind of thing. And that's those things are all those warning signs that people then start to take more seriously. Sadly, people think that medication fixes things. It doesn't fix anything. It just puts a Band-Aid on it. Because if you don't change your diet, and let's say you're on diabetes medication now, and you're like, well, my blood sugars are good now, though I don't have diabetes. Yes, you do. You still have diabetes, because if you didn't change anything and you take the medication away, your blood sugars go up. So that means you still have diabetes, or blood pressure medicine, or triglyceride, like high fat, or meds for fat content in your blood. So all those meds is just a camouflage. They're just a Band-Aid to just put on there. But that's how we live our life. That's the United States of America. It's just, here's a pill, have a pill, and have a donut with it, because that doesn't matter. Doctors will tell you all the time that what you eat doesn't matter, and it's just simply not true, but that's what they do. So yeah, so anyways, I hope that answers the question. Anybody else? All right. Wow, it took me less than an hour. That's a record for me, because I do like to talk. Good, well thanks for coming, guys. I will send this out, just so you know. It's on a PowerPoint presentation, so after I'll email it to you guys so that you have it if you want it. And it is Cassie videotape, not that you guys want to watch me talk anymore, but I'm going to put it on YouTube so that if anybody else wanted to see it but couldn't make it or whatever, they can go on YouTube and watch it.
Thank you, Carla.
Yeah.